I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. We're starting now, and we have a number of other colleagues joining us in the next 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes. This conversation is a privilege because of the two guests of honor, Roya Hakakian, whom you know as a poet, essayist, human rights advocate. She writes for The Atlantic in a number of other places. She has a new essay, fabulous essay in Quillette this week. And if Carolyn has a moment, she'll fish it out and post it in chat. She's also a senior fellow with American Purpose. And so, Roya, welcome. And thank you for agreeing, really curating this program, for agreeing to serve as the moderator. And then Samir Sumaida'ie. It's great to see you, Samir, ambassador, a distinguished voice from Iraq who has served at the highest levels of government and as an ambassador to an important capital. I'm talking to you today from Washington, D.C. And I think what we have in mind, Roy and Samir, is a conversation that indeed takes stock of the news of the day, because we feel deeply for those who are suffering from the earthquake and those who have lost lives in Turkey and Syria. But then a conversation that looks ahead, it has a vision, that takes stock of trends. I think that there's so much to learn from Iraq's experience in the post-Saddam era in so many ways. But I'm also curious to hear from you, Roya, and our guest of honor, Samir, about his perspectives on what's happening inside Iran. It may indeed be a political earthquake of sorts, but change is afoot. Immense opportunities exist now that arguably didn't exist just a year ago. And so with that, welcome Samir, welcome Roya. Roya will lead a conversation the first half of this hour. The second half will be over to you with questions and comments. The colleagues from the gallery will do a hard stop, 1 p.m. Eastern. Roya, over to you.
Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with our colleagues at American Purpose, but an additional pleasure to be in conversation with the ambassador, Samir Sumaida'ie. I mispronounced that, didn't I, Samir?
You did well.
A few years ago, I met Samir at a conference for the first time, and he said several things that I found incredibly intriguing. But perhaps among the most important things that Samir said, which really moved me, was the fact that he decided to leave politics and his involvement with the Iraqi government after the fall of Saddam, because ultimately he had come to the conclusion that there was no hope for him to be able to change anything as long as Iran's influence remained as strong as it was within the Iraqi government. And being, an Iranian American who is concerned about issues in the region, I found that an incredibly important statement and immediately found a kindred spirit in Samir. What's also very wonderful about being in conversation with Samir is that although many people use the term Renaissance man very liberally, it is one that completely applies to Samir in every possible way. We could have just as rich a conversation about with Samir about his poetry, which he's about to publish, a book of poems. We can have a conversation with him about his paintings. We can have a conversation with him about his work as a designer whose work appears throughout the Middle East and adorns some of the holiest sites and important monuments throughout the Middle East and elsewhere. And by the way, all of this began with a degree of electrical engineering after he left Iraq, only as a teenager. So I don't know how many of us can find somebody with such varied talents and interests, with such tremendous accomplishments in every one of those fields. So, but then the electrical engineering graduate student ends up being one of the most important members of the Iraqi opposition prior to 2003. And I guess, Samir, I want to turn this over to you and ask, how does one make such a journey? Leave Iraq as a teenager, go to London, become an engineer, and then end up as being one of the key figures of the Iraqi opposition prior to the fall of Saddam.
Well, Roya, I see that you are turning this meeting to be about me. This meeting is not about me. My personal journey has been interesting indeed. The simple answer is that I'm a person with great curiosity and interest in just about everything, and I cannot turn away. When I get hooked on something, I just pursue it. But while I was doing my design work in my design office in London, I was also active in politics because I saw what was happening to my country. And therefore, I became one of the leaders of the Iraqi oppositions. And when the Americans moved in, we moved in as well. And we took over, and I was a member of the governing council. So at that point, I severed all my business interests and I concentrated on that. So there were different stages of my life, and at every stage, I had to reinvent myself and respond to the need at that moment.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to go back to the first point that basically launched our initial conversation, where you said, I recognize that, and if I'm misquoting you, please correct me, but you mentioned to me a few years ago when we first met that you left politics after nearly 10 years, recognizing that the influence of Iran was getting in the way of you doing the work that you wish to do in Iraq.
That statement still stands. When the Americans went into Iraq and we went back after 26 years of exile, we had great hopes and great dreams, and we had a vision of what kind of Iraq we want to build. But that soon started to break down and disintegrate for two major reasons. One, of the gross mismanagement by the Americans when they took over control in Iraq, and two, by the onslaught of Iranian-backed Islamist parties, particularly the Shia ones, which are the ones which are supported by Iran, on the scene. They effectively perverted the process that we wanted to launch to build a democracy. They used the tools of democracy to seize the state, and from then on, it was downhill all the way. So this is how it actually happened. Let me from the beginning say that I am not an expert on Iran or Iranian affairs. We in Iraq are victims to a very aggressive and expansionist and totalitarian regime next door, one which is besieged and one which sees Iraq as a way to gain not only power, but to milk and get financial resources. And therefore, it's extremely important for Iran, the current Iranian regime, for its own survival, to maintain a very strong grip over Iraq. And that made it impossible for us to do anything. In fact, unsafe, not only impossible in practical terms.
Mm-hmm. And then just a few weeks ago, when we were together at a conference in Europe, you also said, after a talk that I gave, that you had pinned a lot of hopes on the movement in Iran, because if they succeed, then Iraq can possibly look forward to a new future. Could you explain?
Indeed, if the regime in Iran changes and we have a more, if you like, normal state next door, a state that we can deal with as a state, not as a revolution, an ongoing rolling revolution, then we can enter into a different kind of relationship. The relationship built on mutual interests and respect, as long as they respect our sovereignty and independence and our own interest, we will respect theirs. And so this is a completely different universe. At the moment, that is not the case. At the moment, Iran sees itself as the hegemon in the area, especially in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Let's not talk about Yemen and other countries, but in this region, they control things, and they have militias on the ground which threaten any force or person or organization which stands in their way. So the nature of the relationship is likely to change, and therefore it will weaken these militias and forces locally, and it will give a chance for our own indigenous political forces to work in the normal manner.
Mm-hmm. So the protests began in Iran in September, and over the past few weeks, there has been a lull, but for the first few weeks that they were going, they were quite serious and widespread. And as you know, I have said before, they are the most important and most notable series of protests Iran has experienced since 1979. How did you see them? And given that you have already been through the experience of building a coalition and watching a transition and watching the fall of one dictator, how do you see the last 6 months in Iran, and what are your hopes? What are the weaknesses you find in it, and what are the points of concern?
I see them in two ways, Roya. One, as a humanist, as a person who has supported women's rights all my life, as a person who believes in justice and freedom, as a citizen of the world, I see them as a great development for the Iranian people and for Iranian women. But I also view them from the perspective of Iraq. From our perspective, this is obviously a mortal threat to the Iranian regime, which is good news for us. It is anything that weakens their grip over us is extremely welcome. And I think this in a sense, mirrors a development within Iraq itself. In 2019, we had our own revolution, and the young people went onto the streets. Many of them were massacred in cold blood by snipers and militias, which were funded and armed by Iran. And at the end, the uprising was completely suppressed in the most violent way. So the aspirations and the dreams of young Iraqi people reflect the aspirations of and the dreams of young Iranian people. And there is an affinity, there is empathy between the two.
But is there hope for their success? Because in the Iraqi case,
these things work they don't work in a direct causal way. Regimes are weakened, and there is a transition. There is if you like, a path from loss of legitimacy to loss of control. The path from loss of legitimacy to loss of control is very bumpy, and it can be long, but it is, in my view, inevitable. It has to happen. How long it will take, that will depend on so many things, so many factors.
So one of our long conversations a few weeks ago was about my deep curiosity about the way in which the Iraqi opposition organized itself and created a coalition. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And I ask because that's precisely where the Iranian opposition seems to be having trouble trying to figure out, what composition of people, who should be in, who should be out. So I wonder what advice, what aspects of your experience can be important in the process of helping this new coalition build itself?
Well, first, let us highlight the differences between the Iraqi situation and the situation in which the Iraqi opposition was formed from the process that's taking place in Iran. In Iraq, the Americans were involved intimately. There was also in Iraq the Kurdish region. As you know, after 1991, the no-fly zone created an enclave within Iraq, which was out of the control of the central government. And that acted as a base for the opposition. And we used to go and meet there, and actively produce papers, and we have our own activities. This is very different from the situation in Iran, but there are also similarities. The similarities are that in both cases, you have forces that are trying to remove a totalitarian regime which is violent and aggressive, and will not be held to any international standard of justice, and to build that coalition. It's usually the same dynamics. You have people who are very different in their outlook, very different in the way they see the country post-change. And in a sense, they don't share the same language. You need to at least have some common denominator, some rules, ground rules laid down. And even when you do that, in our case, for example, we did have some ground rules. We had conferences in which we had statements which are clear in terms of upholding democratic values after the regime is removed. And you will have people who will sign on to that without any intention of keeping it. The Islamists in Iraq did exactly that. They signed on. Once they got in, that was completely forgotten. So,
and were you aware at the time that this is what they were doing?
No, we took them at their word. My takeaway from that, and my lifelong lesson: never trust the Islamists. Never. They will be the first to lie, cheat, and kill. The Islamists are extremely dangerous, and within any opposition movement, you have to keep an eye on them. They are not the only people who are bad, but you have to make sure that you guard the fundamentals. The fundamentals are how to protect people's rights, how to protect the democratic process, and be vigilant from the early days, from any signs of trying to jump on the state and seize it. That is extremely important. And this is really the lesson that I have taken from a lifelong involvement in politics in Iran.
Mhm. So you spoke of the ground rules, and you said that the Islamists even agreed to the ground rules. But what were they? I know you speak about democratic values and all, but beyond that, there had to be some more specifics.
Okay, let's just remember that when a totalitarian regime falls, democracy is not a default. Democracy has to be built. And you need some basic fundamental agreements to lay down from the beginning and adhere to religiously. The separation between powers. Democracy is not just having elections. It is building institutions which protect rights, the rights of people, the rights of minorities, the rights of women, the rights of children. It's the institutions which protect people's rights are the most important part of democracy. What you have to agree on that, and any coalition which does not adhere to this and declare their adherence and also demonstrate in actions and political positions that they are adhering to these fundamental principles, they are suspect and they have to be called out. This is very important. We did not call out the Islamists from the early transgressions because of the calls for harmony, the calls of not to rock the boat and all that kind of wrong. We were wrong. Once they got control, then they ruthlessly removed everybody else.
That's so incredible, because this is precisely a point of conflict within the Iranian diaspora. You know, some of the members of the diaspora see the reason for criticism of, you know, various leaders within the opposition, but they are always invited to keep quiet in the interest of harmony and solidarity. Exactly.
Don't sacrifice the principles for harmony. Look, there is also, I must say, there is also a tension, in our case certainly, between the diaspora and the people who are inside the country. Now, the people inside the country feel they have more legitimacy, more legitimate right, and should have more influence. The people outside, but they are often, the people inside, they are often lacking in understanding or experience or capacity. And they're a little bit, you know, they are not always fully aware of how actually the world works. People outside have experience, have capacity, but they feel like lack legitimacy. This tension has existed in our case, and it might, I guess, it might exist in the case of Iran as well. But yes, there is also a conflict between I feel like harmony and principles. And I think in this case, my advice would be strongly to ensure that principles are safeguarded. But we don't. I mean, when I say principles, these are not ideologically based principles. These are universal principles, and they can be. It could be a big tent, provided people, you know, accept them. If people don't accept them, well, they might as well be with the regime. So you define them in general terms, not in terms that will exclude anybody, but they have to be clear, and I think they have to be the guiding light. Without them, without a clear set of rules, you will find, and not only clear set of rules, a mechanism which allows for vigilance and allows for calling people out when they step outside them. Without that, I think this would any political effort would come to grief.
Mm-hmm. So I think it is fair to say that if the Iranian regime hadn't already lost its legitimacy, the events of the last 6 months have completely obliterated any legitimacy that the regime had in the eyes of the majority of the people. So that grand step to which you referred is already established. And then there's the question of the bumpy ride to the ultimate fall down. So what is your advice to people who are organizing from point A to point B? How should this generation that wishes to reach that point, given as you mentioned, a very violent regime that has greatly expansive dreams and already has influence throughout the region, how does a peaceful movement reach that second point?
Before I answer that, we have to understand that a regime which appears to be stable is stable because it has built a structure, a power structure, which involves also economic interests. Wide segments of the population identify their economic interests with the survival of the regime. So from the opposition's point of view, one of the strategic objectives must be to draw out people who are on the fringes. You are not going to persuade somebody who is making millions and millions and going to, his life would be threatened by the fall of this regime. That's not realistic. But you have a lot of people who serve in the security forces. They serve not because they are ideologically strong believers, but they get a salary, they get a level of influence, they get a certain amount of social recognition, and they like that to continue. If you draw more and more of these people out and make sure they don't see the change in the regime as a big threat to them, this is a gradual erosion of the power base of the regime. And once that reaches a certain level of maturity and becomes widespread, then you will see the cracks within the regime get wider and it will fall. Now, this is in general terms. Of course, a lot will depend on the specifics, and the dynamics are highly localized.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that the diaspora is asked all the time in meetings with various world leaders is that, what can we do for you? And of course, no one is asking for military intervention, but short of a military intervention, can the international community, America and Europe, play an important role in supporting the Iranian people to get to point B? And if so, what are those recommendations, do you believe, that the opposition should be asking of?
Yes, it's a difficult one, Roya, because of course the regime will, one of the regime's tricks, if you like, is to accuse the opposition as being stooges of the Americans or stooges of the enemies. And so you don't, it's not useful to be directly associated with a foreign power. But having said that, I think there are a number of things that the West, you're not going to get help from Russia or China, forget about that. But the United States, Europe, and other countries which can be sympathetic to the opposition, in the media, also in enabling the opposition inside the country to have a voice, to project their voice, and to enable them to communicate between themselves. Now, one of the tools of the regime is to stop coordination and communication. If some technical help can be given for people inside to communicate and to get around the restrictions of the regime on their communications on the internet and so on, that could be very valuable. But I think encouraging them from outside, giving them political, diplomatic support is very good. And the recent expulsion of Iran from the UN Organization for Women is relevant. It's really gradually discrediting the regime and making sure that its reputation becomes more and more as a dictatorship rather than a normal regime. So it's small things, but a lot of them. I think building up an atmosphere, building up an ecosystem, which helps the opposition and makes life more difficult for the regime.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, Samir, if you've been watching, but this leading Sunni cleric in Baluchistan has become a very strong and beloved voice against the regime and in support of the protesters lately. Do you see a role for religious leaders in Iran or in Iraq, like major Shiite leaders who see why the continued existence of the Iranian regime could actually have a negative impact on the continuation of Islam as a religion of peace, a religion of spirituality in the region? Do you see a role for those individual clerics?
Yes, but beware of sectarianism. Sectarianism is a poison, and it can be extremely destructive, as we have experienced in Iraq, and we continue to experience. I think you have to place yourself firmly within the tent of democracy that protects all religions and protects all sects, and allows for voices from the different sects to come out. But the central pillar must not be based on religion. It must be based on citizenship, people's rights and citizenship. That has to be the center. That has to be the focus. Any voice that comes within that framework is welcome, even if it is a religious voice. A religious voice is most welcome because it can be influential within their flock. But if it is a sectarian voice, if it is Sunni against Shia or Shia against Sunni, that's extremely destructive, and you have to be very wary of it.
Well, I'm going to turn this over to Jeff and to others who I'm sure will have a lot of questions for you. Thank you so much. This has been, even though we've had this conversation before, it still was very enlightening for me. Thank you, Samir.
Well, Roya and Samir, that was splendid. I've taken a lot of notes. I'm going to take the liberty, if I may, of posing a first question to both of you. Roya, President Biden delivered his State of the Union speech on Tuesday, and he omitted any mention of Iran. Did that surprise you? What you make of that? And then Samir, to you, you started down this road, but if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to hear more. The case to Washington of why Iran matters in different ways for the people of Iran, but also the region. And Roya, perhaps you first.
Sure. I was disappointed, obviously. He referred to America's enduring support for freedom throughout the world, and no mention of the one nation that at this particular moment has risen up for freedom. So it was incredibly disappointing. However, I think in some ways, because of a lull inside the country, the administration is possibly waiting to see whether things can, get active again, and whether the protesters will pour into the streets again. I think perhaps there's a concern that if Biden refers to the protests at a time when there hasn't been very many in the past couple of weeks, then he would be accused of provocation. So perhaps that was a concern. But in general, I think he should have at least referred to the last, to the events of September and October and November, and given a statement in support of, the 19,000 people who got arrested, the several hundred people who were killed, and that would have been really meaningful.
Thank you, Samir.
I was disappointed but not surprised. I saw State of the Union address as much more about internal politics than foreign policy. And in any case, foreign policy is very often determined by internal political concerns. Also, the subject, the problem of Iran is not merely suppressing its own people. It's not merely a question of freedom. It's a destabilizing agent in the whole region. It is a threat to peace. It is its influence outside the border of its state is so diabolical, so damaging. And actually, and of course, its attempt or positioning itself to be able to produce a nuclear bomb is yet another aspect of its potential danger to world peace. So when you put all that together, yes, of course, the demonstrations in Iran are a major concern, and suppressing them is terrible and has to be condemned. But that's only one part of the picture. And when you look at Iran as a whole, their support now for Russia and the war, aggressive war in Ukraine and everywhere else, they are a very negative and destructive agent. So I think they should be looked at in that context. And I would have expected some reference to Iran from this wider perspective.
So thank you both. The floor is now open to the gallery, distinguished people and deep talent. If I do not see your raised hand through the raised hand function or waving at me, colleague Carolyn will point me in your direction. Who would like to be first with a question or comment? There you are from Brussels. Could you join?
Yes, thank you. It was very great listening to you. Thank you very much. I would like to ask, you said very beautifully that
Sorry to interrupt you. In each case, would you all introduce yourselves very briefly? I know who you are, but maybe not everybody.
Makes sense. So I'm a student from Belgium, from Brussels. My dad is in Iranian politics, and I would like to perhaps be involved, although it is quite a senior culture. I might be a bit too young still. Anyway, I really liked the schematics you made, and with your insight of Iraq, you said very well. Iran took the tools of democracy, and you described the power structures of a state, including economic interests. Now, knowing that the Sepah, like the military police, has around 40% of the economy, at least like important parts, the ports, industrial centers, how, with your insight in Iraq, how do you view, let's say the 99% does come into the street and the government does get destabilized and you do get a proper revolution? How do you feel democratic forces should do to make the direction go well, considering the power structures they're conservative, they're weaponized, and they have 40% of the economy? What would you have wanted to see different in Iraq? Would you want to prepare Iranians for, if possible?
Okay, first, I would encourage you to get involved.
Thank you.
Don't worry about being too young, because this is actually a revolution of the youth. So forget about our generation. It's you who are the agents of change. So do get involved. Secondly, on your second question, of course, I said I am no expert, but in general, when the most important for individuals, the most important thing for individuals is their own survival. And yes, many of the security forces in Iran and the Basij and others who have economic interest will feel threatened by a change, but you have to wean them off gradually. Sudden changes, like throwing them all out on the street immediately, disbanding this, and this was a mistake which was done in Iraq, and it was catastrophic. They disbanded the army, which was huge, and suddenly, experienced army officers who have fought all their lives in the war against Iran and other wars found themselves in the street without a salary, without anything. So I would say, be careful, be gradual, get people, make sure that people don't lose their livelihood, but make the change in a way that makes sense. Make it gradually, and make it in a way that people are with you and not against you.
So thank you for that. Jeremiah, are you there? And did you have a question or comment?
I do. Thank you, Jeff. Greetings, everyone. Mr. Ambassador, Roya, nice to see you all. My name is Jeremiah Berenberg. I'm a strategic communications consultant from Washington, D.C. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I'm also on the board of the American Jewish Committee. My question for you, Mr. Ambassador, is thank you for your service and your incredible presentation and courage. What would you like to see amongst, let's say, this community, this call, but also folks living in America or elsewhere who believe themselves to be allies of this cause, of these challenges? There are diaspora groups living and organizing in other countries, and there are also advocates such as myself and others in allied groups. We are working to raise awareness about these issues, and we have our strategies. But in your mind, what would be some of either ideas or topics? Where do you think is the biggest bang for the buck in terms of supporting these issues from the outside in, and how best to do that? Because we don't certainly want to engage in activities that would be counterproductive. So I'd be interested to hear your point of view about the level of organizing in the outside world, Western world or others, and what's most effective. And sorry for the background noise in the coffee shop.
Well, I can only draw on my experience when we were in the opposition to Saddam's regime. I think the focus must be to organize. Organize in a way that brings people together, have clarity of purpose, give people inside the feeling that they are not alone, that in the outside world, there is a whole lot of support for them. There are people who hear them, there are people who are working for them, and there are people who will be with them when the change comes. That is important. Get that message in. But most importantly, organize, but organize on the right principles. Organize not just for the sake of organization, but for making these organizations basically generate a roadmap for future development, for future health, and a correct direction. It is not just, this is not a talking club, this is a club which has purpose, and the purpose should be stated clearly, and this takes work. It doesn't happen by itself.
Samir, Jeremiah, thank you for that very much. Let me turn to Marina, who joins us from Slovakia, writer, editor, close colleague.
Thank you, Jeff. And I'm very, very thankful for being able to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I learned a lot. And I must say that with my experience of Central Europe, where we toppled communism 33 decades ago, I must say that, yeah, really, the best and the worst comes out in people during the times of revolutions. And if we do not stick to principles, and if we do sacrifice the principles for harmony, for false harmony, most of the times, it comes back, it fires back. So I really resonate with this. But how do you actually, in the times of revolution, how do you make it obvious to people that institutions are the best? Because people usually only want free elections as the first step, but they don't really see the importance of institutions. They tend to think that free elections are the first and the last condition of democracy.
Absolutely.
And to see institutions as important requires some level of enlightenment, right?
That's the role of leadership. Leadership should be helping to improve, to increase awareness, to educate. Leadership is to lead, and you have to show the way. It is very important, and if you fail in that, you pay the price. There is a direct price, it's a painful price, which you will pay when you fail in this task. You need to point out that there are people who are ready to jump and seize power, even through it. One man, one vote, one time, and then forget about it. Then they control everything, and then the next elections will all be a sham. So you have to be yourself, first of all, be aware of the danger, and second, on increasing the awareness. There is no shortcut in this. It's hard because a lot of people do, when a totalitarian regime falls, it's like people coming out of a cellar where there is no light, suddenly into the sun. They cannot see very clearly. They're just happy to be free. But then you will get the predators who will be ready to jump and seize power and make all of them again as victims. So you have to be really aware and aware of this danger and vigilant and educate people. That's the role of leadership. You fail, you lose.
Thank you.
So Marina, thank you for that part of the conversation. Can we turn to you, Zainab, our colleague from the Hudson Institute, and if you wouldn't mind, just say a word about your current work, and then you have the floor.
Well, thank you all for your wonderful insights, and thank you for the invitation. So yes, I'm from the Hudson Institute and joining from DC. I usually cover anything related to Iran, Iranian expansionism, but I'm also very much involved in China's influence in the Middle East. So I'm originally from Morocco, and I have always followed Iran's expansionism, as Ambassador Sumaida'ie mentioned. And so I have a question for you both, because from my perspective, I don't see the unrest going anywhere anytime soon. The young generation made it clear that the clerical regime isn't suitable. But what would you like ideally to see from a US foreign policy side? You think it is possible to suffocate the regime more, especially that they're targeting, activists like Ahmadinejad, the writers as Rushdie, they even go after Western officials, whether it's in the US or the UK. Now they are helping Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. What would you like to see changing from a US foreign policy side in handling Iran? Thank you.
Well, thank you. You put me on the spot. It's a tough question because actually the position of the US is difficult. Let me draw on our own experience in Iraq. Sanctions were imposed on Iraq after 1990-91 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. At that time, I was living in London at that time, and I was active politically against the regime, and I welcomed those sanctions because from my perspective, they are going to weaken the regime. Later, I regretted that position. I believe those sanctions hurt the people. They did not hurt the regime very much. They caused actually considerable. Let me just give you a very, very quick anecdotal. Well, actually, I think it's more than anecdotal. In 2004, I was Minister of Interior in Baghdad. And I discovered very quickly that senior officials of the ministry who were in place when the change took place were very corrupt. But people who had been retired before the sanctions were generally clean. The sanctions made corruption endemic, and they made it universal in Iraq. So there was a deterioration in the state itself, a disintegration, a social and moral, I would say, disintegration. So sanctions themselves, they sound good. They think they will be helpful, but actually they are often not. What would be much more practically useful is for the United States to put some clear red lines for Iran in terms of their actions in the region, not to cross. And if they cross, there will be a price, and the price has to be painful. And if necessary, if the price is military, it has to be done. It has to demonstrate, I mean, the United States administration has to demonstrate that they are not a paper tiger. They have teeth, and the teeth will bite and they will hurt. Iran does not understand any language. Iranian regime, I would correct, do not understand any language except the language of force and clarity. This has not been the case, unfortunately. The United States and the West must have these red lines clear, and then there must be consequences for the regime, not for individuals in the regime, for the regime as a whole, and for the military of the regime to pay if these lines are crossed.
So thank you, Zainab, but thank you, Samir, for that. We are now close at the end of our precious hour together. And Roya, let me turn to you for final reflections, thoughts, proposals going forward.
As I watch Iran rush to the aid of Russia, and as I listen to Samir and all the valuable lessons that he has to impart, I feel like the evildoers are in some ways ahead of us. They realize the value of solidarity, and the rest of us may be in some ways not as organized as they are, and we should be. Every time I've spoken to Samir, I feel like his knowledge is not only important for Iraqis, but it can play a very significant role at this moment for Iran and others in the region. I think the points that you made, Samir, about not compromising on behalf of solidarity at this moment is very key. I already see, how people are inviting each other into silence in the interest of togetherness and fighting the regime. And I think the point that you also make about working gradually to peel away at those who are loosely attached to the regime is an excellent one. Except trying to figure out how that can actually be implemented, it becomes a major question. So on that note, I hope we hear from you more. There were questions I didn't get to ask, especially about the role of the Islamists, and also your decisions to allow the Kurdish minorities to join the coalition, even knowing that they may renege on some of their promises. These are some of the issues that the Iranian opposition are still thinking about and dealing with. And I think there is room to have a second conversation with you in the future. And I hope we do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roya. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, everybody. And then indeed, more soon. Thank you all. Good afternoon, good evening.